Up next in today's Beyond the Index conference is ProcureAM ETFs. Presenting today will be co-founder and CEO Andrew Chanin. Before we begin, I'd like to share an important notice. The following presentation is for informational purposes only and does not constitute an offer to sell or solicitation to purchase any security. Investors should carefully consider an ETF's investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses before investing. This and other important information is contained in the fund's prospectus, which should be read carefully before investing. The views and information presented are those of the presenter and ETF sponsor. Andrew, please go right ahead.
Thank you so much for that great introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. Everyone joining us today, thank you for being here. You could have been anywhere in the universe, but you're here today to learn about the world's first pure play space ETF, ticker UFO. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Andrew Chanin. I am CEO and co-founder of ProcureAM. We're an innovative ETF company that looks to provide investors with access to difficult to access investment opportunities. And UFO was the first ETF that we launched back in 2019. So we have over 7 years of UFO being in the marketplace. And we're thrilled to talk about not just the ETF today, but also a brief little bit about the history of the space industry, some of the catalysts that are already occurring in front of us today, and where we might be headed, as well as some information about the Procure Space ETF UFO. For those that don't know me, my background has been in the exchange traded fund industry since 2007. I've worked as a lead market maker for global and international equity ETFs on the floor of the American Stock Exchange. I've helped build proprietary trading desks, trading in ETFs, and started giving ETF ideas away to existing issuers that weren't in the marketplace. They went on to launch them, and eventually one of them said, "Why do you keep on giving us your ideas? You should try launching your own." And that actually led to me sponsoring some world's first investment opportunities, such as the world's first cybersecurity ETF, as well as the first junior silver and exploration ETF, the first video game ETF, the first digital mobile electronic payments ETF, as well as other many firsts to market. So hopefully, that helps provide a little bit of credibility or background, and hopefully you enjoy what we have to present today. So if you look back at the history of space in its early forms of being an industry was really just kind of left open to just to nation states, so countries, militaries, and what really kicked it off was in 1961, where Yuri Gagarin became the first human to actually orbit space. And I think you could probably attribute a lot of all the amazing accomplishments that we've achieved as America because of that pressure that the USSR put on the United States for sending the first human into orbit into space. And then if you fast forward to 1969, an event that some of you maybe got to witness firsthand or on TV or on the radio, or the rest of us get to hear about the amazing accomplishments of July 1969, where the Apollo 11 landed humans on the moon for the first time, arguably, possibly the greatest engineering achievement of humankind to date. In 1981, you may be familiar with the space shuttle. The space program was doing a lot more, where we also started to do things like GPS, and started doing things that provided benefits for civilians. But if you look at kind of a common thread across a lot of this, you'll see that only nation states had the capital back in the day and the technology. The risks were extremely high to go to space. And if you wanted exposure to the space industry for those kind of 60 years, unless you were an astronaut or worked at a company that was trying to provide solutions for NASA and others, being a taxpayer was pretty much the best way that you could actually get exposure to the space industry. And why I think that it's relevant to talk about the past is because of some of these catalysts that brought us about to launch the space ETF UFO, was that there were some of these catalysts and that government monopoly began to break. So, taking us to closer to modern times, but not to current present, in 2002, SpaceX was founded. SpaceX, as most people here on this phone call and webinar are aware, was the largest IPO ever in financial markets in human history. And we got to enjoy this American company coming to the public markets in the United States, but their journey started in the early 2000s by a visionary or a madman, depending on who you are, what your opinion is. SpaceX had many bold goals, and one of the main things that they were looking to do was to significantly reduce the cost of accessing space. So this was brought about by the advent of reusable rockets, which essentially helped to significantly reduce the time in between launches because back in the day, the common way to get to space was to build something from scratch. And then once it achieved its goal, it was pretty much scrapped or saved for a museum. And if you wanted to go to space again, you were rebuilding a brand new spacecraft. And the cost, the time that it takes to do something like that is part of the reason that the cost of accessing space was significantly higher than it is today. I had made a chart with two interesting graphs on it that didn't make it to the final cut. One showing the cadence, the amount of launches per year, and it looked like this on the chart, and the opposite chart that was going to be underneath it was one showing the cost of launch for space, and it looks very much like an X. The amount of launches that we're seeing currently today it is radically higher than it had been previously. SpaceX being the largest as far as amount of weight launched into space represents between 80 and 90% of launch payload capacity currently as of this past year. And kind of right behind SpaceX is China. And if it wasn't because of a company like SpaceX, the US could potentially be lagging China in the space race, which is becoming extremely critical today. The one of the goals of SpaceX is to significantly reduce the cost of launch, possibly even to under $100 per kilogram. We're still a bit, above where that is today. A lot of analysts look at, possibly $150 per kilogram to go into space as a potentially realistic goal for the not too distant future. But what they're trying to build over at SpaceX with their next generation of Starship rockets could have that potential once they're fully operational, commercially operational, and building these rapidly and deploying them around the world is something that is potentially feasible. Something that people back in 2002 probably would have laughed at, but here we are today. So the space economy as of 2000 and 2025 is actually by the Space Foundation, which is the largest non-profit, non-biased entity focused on the overall space industry. Came out with their numbers just towards the end of July and showed that in 2025, that the size of the global space economy was roughly $686 billion, up about 12% year over year. And I want to kind of break that down for you. So we talked about in the early days of the space industry that the space industry was almost entirely government funded, and that is no longer the case. Roughly 79%, almost 80% in 2025 was actually commercial. And so broadband, positioning, navigation, Earth observation, launch services, this is not a government spending story anymore. Certainly, government spending does help, and we do see various pockets and areas where government spending is still, very important and driving a lot of innovation. But it's commercial infrastructure that is also now becoming, a major driver. So governments and defense make up roughly $141 billion of that 686 billion mentioned, and global military space spending crossed $150 billion last year for the first time, which has been a growing share of the overall space economy. And later we'll come back to why that matters. There's about 12 billion plus dollars in private investment last year alone. Orbital data centers, launch satellites. The Space Foundation's own projections is that this crosses $1 trillion potentially as soon as 2032. So this isn't a 20-year story. It's roughly a 6-year story from where we're sitting at today, which I think for a lot of observers that have been watching the space industry would be really pleased if we could hit that number. So, the next chapter of space. Probably one of the more underappreciated areas for a potentially growing space economy is compute. And we're hearing about it nonstop on the financial news networks and if you're reading financial publications, but compute is starting to move to orbit. And it's being pulled there because we have some terrestrial problems. On July 14th of this year, the New York governor, Governor Hochul, signed the first statewide moratorium in the United States on new hyperscale and data centers. 50 megawatts and up in New York. The grid simply can't keep up with AI compute demand as it currently stands. And this isn't just a New York problem or something that's being considered in New York. It's a preview of the constraints that show up everywhere where power-hungry AI and infrastructure wants to land. The orbital answer is already happening. StarCloud raised $170 million in a Series A at a $1.1 billion valuation, and they already have Nvidia H100 in orbit. So it's not a concept. It's a flying hardware currently today. We're currently working on future iterations. SpaceX, which we had mentioned previously, along with Google and Axiom, Thales, a European space company, all filing various plans in the orbital data space. And we'll also probably be discussing this later again in disclosures when you read through it. But not every name that I mentioned just previously or will mention is necessarily a holding in UFO. And we'll go into telling you why certain companies make the cut and certain don't later on in this presentation. But SpaceX and Thales are portfolio in the portfolio today as of last night's close. Um, and but that's why we're also looking at presenting an investment opportunity that uses an index to define what space is. UFO currently holds satellite manufacturers and operators, launch providers, ground infrastructure that both do commercial compute capabilities and defense demand, which depend on these various types of compute needs for national defense and security. So these are some of the areas how space might help us with some modern day problems, but space is already part of our everyday lives. So let me start off with asking you a question on this slide. How many of you have touched space this week? I bet pretty much everyone in this discussion has, and maybe you haven't considered it, whether you have or not, but very good chance that everyone here watching today has touched space at least once this week. SiriusXM is a satellite radio provider, giving you connectivity in your car. Garmin is a GPS signal from space. Many people have these embedded into their smartwatches, or if you captain any boats, Garmin is frequently seen for maritime purposes. AST Space Mobile, a name that's been getting a lot of coverage in recent weeks, especially following SpaceX's most recent earnings call. They had mentioned of Starlink Mobile, which could potentially be a competitor to AS Space Mobile, but AST Space Mobile provides cell signals that reach cell towers where cell towers can't, directly to your phone if you're traveling off grid. But essentially, space stopped being a frontier story a while ago, and currently infrastructure is already embedded into our daily life. The investment opportunity is now catching up to that reality. So how do you actually get exposure to all of this in one trade? Potentially UFO, the world's first pure play space ETF. Listed on Nasdaq, it's the first pure play space ETF, and it's been trading since April of 2019, and it seeks to track the performance of the VettaFi Space Index before fees and expenses. There's a couple things I'd want you to hopefully take away, and that is that this is exchange traded access to several areas, to launch providers, to satellite makers and manufacturers, ground equipment, telecom operators, all in one trade. It's a rules-based and transparent strategy. This is not actively managed. This is not making a single bet on an individual company or an individual country. Every holding in the fund is publicly traded and priced daily. And it's in a global category focus that can include small, mid, large, mega cap listings from across the Americas, Europe, and Asia Pacific. And UFO Many of you, if you have already invested in the fund in the past, may be aware that UFO held Rocket Lab and AST Space Mobile years before either became household names. And that's kind of one of the arguments that we make for why people might want to consider owning a category and owning it early through a rules-based index rather than trying to guess which single individual name might become the next headline. And so hopefully, if you look at the fund today, on the next slide, you will see that uh, there's a 7-year track record. We won't get into discussing performance, but for anyone that's curious, we'll provide you information for a link to our website so you can find that directly. The expense ratio for the fund is 75 basis points, which is fairly in line with thematic ETF peers. There's currently roughly 66 holdings in UFO. Similar to the index, the fund is rebalanced quarterly and reconstituted semi-annually. So it's at these time periods that you can find certain names that now qualify that didn't previously, based on those rules, may be eligible for inclusion. And similarly, during reconstitutions, if a name no longer meets the methodology requirements, that those names can be removed from the fund. There were times where the fund had, roughly 30 names in it, but as the global space economy itself has grown, the amount of pure play space opportunities trading around the globe has increased. It has allowed for additional exposure into many new companies, technologies, and geographies that quite simply weren't necessarily available when the fund initially launched in 2019. But that is just one example of how this fund is living, breathing, and looking at the space economy today and how it may evolve potentially into the future. So, I'd like to talk about the index. We are really proud to be licensing the Verify Space Index. They set the rules, which are very important. At least 80% of the underlying index at rebalance goes into companies that derive at least 50% or more of their revenues from space-related businesses, activities, and services. Space-related has a real bar, and space-based function has to be essentially to the product, not a peripheral feature bolted on to an otherwise ordinary company. It's also global by design, small, mid, large cap across the Americas, Europe, and Asia, because space is not just a US story, a North America story. This has been an industry that has been highly collaborative over the years. If you look at the conflicts, starting with the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, you'll see that space was front and center in this entire scenario. And as troops and supply buildup started occurring at the borders of Ukraine, it was satellite imagery being presented by satellite companies that were providing this real-time information of this war that was about to start. Once the conflict began, we started seeing satellite jamming becoming a strategy for stopping or slowing down the ability to communicate strategically. We saw Russia taking hostage of numerous satellites owned by OneWeb at the Kazakhstan Baikonur launch base. OneWeb, a company owned significantly by the UK government. So this was a strategic geopolitical hostage taking of vital technology for the UK government. We also saw Russia refusing to export certain parts that are very useful for space rocket engine manufacturing. And it started causing countries, companies, militaries, and even individuals to start to come up with their own space plan. How will we move forward? And so these have all become very important as military is now viewed as the strategic high ground of warfare, currently. And this is just another one of these potential catalysts. It's not just that the cost of accessing space has been driven down dramatically over the last decade, but space is extremely important for defense purposes, which is why we're seeing things like this increased military spending and budget. The modern space race now, as opposed to the early days of Yuri Gagarin and the Apollo 11 lunar landing, which was more of a vanity project, I would say, which was, hey, this is great. Look at what we did. This is now having real stakes. And losing is not something that people want to do. Many nations are vying to become the global space power. There may be one, there may be several, but right now those stakes are being planted to determine who will have the infrastructure of the rest of this century as it's currently being built out today. To give a little bit more information about the underlying index, which helps power the UFO space ETF, the index organizes the space economy into five different segments. We have rocket and satellite manufacturing, ground equipment manufacturing, space technology and hardware, space-based imagery and intelligence, and telecom, TV, and radio broadcasting. And it's a deliberately broad scope. It's not just rocket companies and launch. It's, a large amount of the value chain that makes this economy that we talked about earlier in the presentation. Geographically, as of the end of June this year, roughly 81% of the underlying index have been focused in US listed companies, with the balance spread across Canada, the Netherlands. Japan has become a very large player in the space industry, Luxembourg, South Korea, and others. So, yes, there is a heavy US concentration. Um, and the US is a major provider and leader in the space industry, but it's not the only thing that matters here. We are seeing innovations being created from around the world, and it's also very difficult for many investors, particularly retail investors, to get exposure to foreign companies. UFO might be one of those ways that investors can actually access some of these harder to find or invest in names. So, for those of you that might be interested in learning more about the Procure Space ETF UFO, you can see on this slide, you can reach us through our website, procureetfs.com. On there, you can find some information, some interesting information and documents about the fund, some thought pieces about the space industry beyond just our ETF. You can see our phone number for reaching out to contact us directly, email us, or snail mail us. We're there and we're looking forward to hopefully answering many questions with you as the space industry evolves. Also would like to show you just our disclosure considerations. That gives you some more information about some of the information I shared on this call. Certainly, as always, talk to your financial professional before you make an investment. Read the fund's prospectus. These are all very important documents or areas where you might be able to learn more before you make an investment. I'm also told that we do have some questions for Q&A today, so I'd love to help answer them if you're able to help pull them up on the screen.
I'll just read them aloud to you here, Andrew.
Perfect.
First one here. Space investing for years had sounded fairly speculative, but as you mentioned in your excellent presentation, satellites now underpin communications, navigation, weather data, agriculture, logistics, national security. Now, where has the space economy crossed from an emerging technology story into essential infrastructure, and where is that transition still incomplete?
So I think there are, numerous catalysts still potentially ahead for the space industry, but some of these things are starting to emerge today. And I'm glad that you brought up some of those areas where we're seeing kind of the connectivity to space. One of the hardest things that I find is helping people understand what space is. To many people, it's far off, it's science fiction, it's something about movies and interesting, novels that people have read, and it's not necessarily as tangible to everyone. But you see billions of dollars being invested into things like cloud computing, Internet of Things, connected devices, AI, even blockchain and cryptocurrency. And there's this kind of common thread amongst all these industries, which many people, whether intentionally or unintentionally, seem to miss. And in many of these cases, we're talking about data being this common thread. It's being produced in one place, and most times it's being sent to another. And in so many of these use cases, space is providing these various assets that are operating as the digital data toll operator on the digital data superhighway. And so satellites are helping with this, ground stations are helping with this. And so to the extent that people are seeing this massive need for data, this massive generation of data, sometimes this data is even being generated in space from satellites, from imagery, observation, and whatnot, and then is being sent down to Earth as well. And as we talk about data centers in space, this is also a potential another area where we have data being going from one place on Earth to space or space to Earth. And in order to have all these industries functioning, we need a vibrant space economy. And so a lot of this infrastructure is put in place today, but we're seeing numerous types of next generation technologies being developed. And in many cases, space is at the helm of this innovation. So you need launch to send these space assets to space. You need sensors, you need communication tools in order for the satellites to receive this information and then send it to where else it needs to go. So there are many different areas. Don't count out the defense, the military use cases for space because this is very important as well. But we're only starting to scratch the surface. And the further we can drive down the cost of accessing space, the more companies, individuals, governments have the ability to build out things to understand more about what's possible for the overall space economy. So we're excited to see what catalysts present themselves, but many were essentially previously not economically viable because of the cost of accessing space. So we're excited to see what innovation can present itself in the near future.
Andrew, as you've made very clear in your presentation, some of the largest positions in your portfolio are simply not rocket companies. For example, you mentioned Garmin, also Trimble. These are among the biggest holdings in your portfolio. Let's get more into what navigation, positioning, and geospatial technologies tell us about where the economics of space are actually being captured today.
So GPS is extremely important thanks to the US military. Many of us have GPS capabilities in our smartphones. There are actually other nations that are building their own rivals to GPS. In China, they have their own version that they're working on. But to be an individual working in or utilizing the modern economy, in many cases, GPS is extremely important, whether it's figuring out the fastest route to get to your house to an event or a meeting that you need to be at, whether it's app delivery services, being able to provide you with real-time information of when that Uber or that food delivery might arrive. GPS is extremely important. Then you even have companies that are not space companies that are utilizing GPS for autonomous purposes. So tractor companies that are trying to use GPS coordinates to autonomously navigate things like tractors. As we build out our capabilities on the moon, having the ability to have autonomous devices that could hopefully build out habitats on the moon and beyond for us before we actually send humans there, will also be extremely critical. Connected devices, Internet of Things, using slightly different technologies, but navigation and communications will be extremely important. SpaceX, as many of you may be aware, are trying to have goals of building out permanent human colony on Mars and being able to have autonomous humanoid robots or other apparatuses, technologies that can help build out those permanent colonies before humans even set foot on Mars could be very helpful and also minimize the human risks of going to some of these far off distant places. So GPS, navigation, communication, things like the Ka band, like a company like Iridium has been specializing in, which is soon expected to have a merger with Rocket Lab, another large holding in the fund. These are all very important areas of the space economy. And again, the cheaper we can get to space, the more technologies and things that we might be able to see built off of these or improvements to these existing systems.
This is a question about SpaceX and Rocket Lab, Andrew. SpaceX, as you said, is now one of UFO's larger holdings following the public listing, and Rocket Lab is another one of your significant positions. Now, from an investment perspective, how do you think about the economics of a vertically integrated space company combining launch, spacecraft, components, and potentially recurring services versus a company concentrated in one layer of the value chain?
I think there's room for numerous types of structures of companies to be able to compete here. SpaceX loves to vertically integrate. We've also seen Rocket Lab step up and make a lot of strategic acquisitions. Many knew them originally as a rocket and a launch company, but some strategic acquisitions have allowed them to start moving into the satellite manufacturing area, as well as this potential merger or acquisition of Iridium, which could not only provide them with their own owned satellite manufacturer and operator, but a client for launch. And so, as we see technologies evolve, as we see companies start to build out their roadmap for the future, it's exciting to see how these companies are starting to evolve, and especially in the M&A world, where this used to be an area that only the large diversified aerospace and defense names were able to play in because of the dollar amounts going into some of these acquisitions. We're starting to see new players start to step forward. You're starting to see companies like SpaceX, Rocket Lab, and others start to become one of those out there that can look for interesting opportunities to build out their own capabilities.
Thank you very much for that, Andrew. And for more information about ProcureAM and its funds, please visit the sponsor's website where you can access the relevant fund prospectuses and any more questions. For questions about today's conference, contact Redchip at 1-800-REDCHIP or info@redchip.com.